We've now reached presentation 24 in the series where we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew. I've entitled this Training the Disciples, but as usual let's just look back at the previous presentation to see how it links up. In the previous presentation we saw there were three events. Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you think I really am?" Peter speaks for them. The Christ, the Messiah, the sent one of God, the Son of the living God, one filled with all the fullness of the nature of God. Then he goes on to show them what he's got to do. The cross and the resurrection lay ahead. They didn't understand that. Then he takes a small inner group and he shows who he really is. And the voice said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." A straightforward instruction and command to us all today. We touched upon this difficult passage, one that has been used and abused to justify all kinds of things. We need to look at what Jesus actually said in the original language. Gates of hell is totally misleading. The word there and the phrase there speak of the threat or the fear of death. And it's certainly true that in the early followers of Jesus, the threat of death was ever there for them, but they went on. The word church isn't an institution, it isn't an organization, it isn't a hierarchy. The word couldn't mean that. It speaks of a community, a local community. Two words, but basically they're the same word. And in the original Hebrew language they would be the same word. But it's a play on words. Jesus is giving Simon a nickname. Simon, the unstable, emotional Simon, you're going to be like a rock. You're going to have stability. And the kingdom of heaven, not an institution. The kingdom of heaven is where Jesus is followed and obeyed, where we seek to live his way. That allows us to get the meaning of the verse. We could summarize it this way: the local communities of the followers of Jesus and the kingdom of heaven is where Jesus is king. Jesus came to bring the kingdom, not to establish the church. The local communities of the followers of Jesus came out of the kingdom. But Peter's stability would give direction to the kingdom, to its growth and its expansion in its early years. And Jesus said, "On this rock I will build of me the church." That's how it's written literally, because the emphasis is on the "of me." But remember, this doesn't imply an organized structure or a hierarchy. It's just a local group of the followers of Jesus. And it's centered on Jesus. These are the people who've come into the kingdom. They come together to support and help each other in a society which was highly hostile. Now what Jesus is showing here is that there'll be a new people of God. They'll be built around himself. And Peter's role in stable leadership would be critical. And if we look at the events around Jerusalem in the decades that followed the life of Jesus, Peter's role was critical. He did bring stability. He then passed it on to the brother of Jesus, James. That's what the picture is all about. And Jesus had begun to get, Peter had begun to get what Jesus was all about. He hadn't got it all, and he's going to make many more mistakes. But Peter was going to be the stable person and give direction to the kingdom growth. Now this presentation, in a sense, is the first of three parts. Ideally, if we could make the presentation long enough, it would encompass these chapters. In this presentation we're going to look at 17 and part of 18. The next one will go from 18 into end of 19, and then finally into chapter 20. But they're linked, and they're all to do with the training of the disciples. They'd begun to get who Jesus was. Incomplete perhaps, but they'd begun to get it. So he starts in the north, in the area around Capernaum, and he moves south. But he's training them all the time. The first section, which we'll focus on here, that's the themes we're going to look at. We then move into the second section, the next presentation. A whole string of very, very practical issues. The disciples need to be trained. Jesus is going to be crucified, resurrected, ascended. They'll be on their own. But in a sense, Jesus would be with them totally throughout their lives. And then the final stretch, continuing again, looking at kingdom, grace, victory, leadership and healing. Positive things as they got closer to Jerusalem and to all the onslaught that would be launched against Jesus there. Again, a map helps us. Most of his time he spent up in the north, around the Lake of Galilee. The last few presentations seen Jesus withdrew outside the territory. He wanted time with his disciples. He didn't want to be captured too early. He was starting the training program. Nazareth was a backwater, a little hill country village. Capernaum was on the trade routes, a great stepping off point, and it's where Peter stayed. In the south, Jericho, also on a trade route, and Jerusalem, the capital city with the temple, the religious centre. And over these three presentations we'll see that Jesus moves south from his work in the north and eventually comes to Jerusalem. Now he took a decision, several decisions. A decision that this was the right time to travel to Jerusalem, knowing what faced him. He would celebrate Passover there. Great Jewish festival. And then there would be the final confrontation when the religious and political authorities took Jesus on. Jesus allowed himself to be captured, flogged, and tortured to death. But that wasn't the end. He had to train his disciples for what lay ahead. There are many issues. The disciples had to work things out. What are the implications for us? What are the implications for us when Jesus is not there physically? How are they going to react? How are they going to behave? How are they going to continue the work on? Been a wonderful period of time with Jesus. What was their status? Where did they fit into this kingdom that Jesus had brought in? They didn't fully understand that. Major issues they had to address, and the training program that Jesus took these disciples through deals with many of these issues. They just couldn't get that. And if we'd been in their shoes, we wouldn't have got it either. There's a whole series of events that were lying ahead for Jesus, and Jesus knew what they were. And he had to prepare his disciples for that, so they could go through and come out the other end and take the work of Jesus forward into a great future. Now, with that backcloth in mind, let's look at the first stretch of this presentation. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire, into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." "You unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Jesus rebuked the demon, it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. And the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "Because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, and you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, nothing will be impossible for you." When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. We moved from the transfiguration, which occurred outside Jewish territory, and they met this situation. Then they came back into the Galilee area. Now the word that's used there is not the word for epilepsy. The word that's used there implies a spiritual nature behind the affliction. Essentially, it's a lesson in faith. Oh, how we struggle with this. Why does the healing not occur? Where have we gone wrong? Why could we not do it? Why couldn't we drive it out, as the disciples said? But just what is faith, and what's its significance here? Now the story is also told in Mark and Luke, and as is so often the case, the Mark account gives a lot more detail. Mark builds his gospel around the actions of Jesus, and the healing miracles were a major part of that. Matthew and Luke interpret it, and therefore the account is shorter. Matthew interpreting it from people from a Jewish background, Luke from people from a non-Jewish background. John looks at it all, interprets it from the distance of time and maturity. So we're relying on Mark here quite a lot for the detail. We noted the word. It was demonization. It was not epilepsy. The word for that was not used. In Mark's account, it tells us that. And the boy was deaf and mute. And the poor father is desperate. And the expulsion was violent on the boy. But essentially it's a lesson in the role of faith. Why couldn't we drive it out? How many of us have asked a question like that when it comes to healing miracles? Now, in simple terms, but we've got to interpret this into practical terms, the difference between failure and success is the presence of Jesus. The disciples couldn't drive it out. Jesus could. We have got to learn how to have Jesus right back at the center of the frame. Expelling demons. In the biblical accounts, there are no confusions between healings, expelling demons, and other things. Demons were expelled. Healing was given and released. 3 key requirements can be seen in this story. This applies to any miracle of healing particularly. We need Jesus at the center. It's only his authority that can command the demon to leave. But he passes that authority on to his followers. But we've got to work in his authority, not in our self-effort or our formulae. But there's got to be an atmosphere of faith. That's not just the person who's declaring the healing, but it's also in the people round about. They can undo it, by simply not expecting anything to happen and having no belief that it's going to happen. Faith is central, but it's bigger than one person. And there's prayer. Not because God will listen to us if we pray and pray on and on and on for hours on end. Prayer can be very short. Look at the Lord's Prayer. Is a sign of our dependence on Jesus. So there's 3 requirements, and this pattern can be seen again and again in the biblical accounts of healing miracles and expulsions. Quotation from the great theologian. Wise words. Faith is not a measurable commodity, but a relationship. The problem is we try to screw up our faith, say, I believe, help me, I must believe. That's not what it's all about. It's an expression of relationship. And the focus is on the unlimited power of God, on which faith, any faith, can draw. It's God who does it, not us. Not our self-effort, not us screwing up our determination or our faith. It's simply trusting the unlimited power of God. And that comes from a relationship with Him. The problem is we've made faith intellectual. Believe A, B, C, sign here, you're in. That's not what it's all about. The word faith in the original language is a word of action, a word of response. It's part of relationship. We respond to what God is saying, what God is doing, to His unlimited power. We must have confidence in it. But you can have total confidence without any intellectual depth. Watch the young child, their confidence in their parent. But it means direct action. It's not just in the brain. It means taking the step and doing something. It is a response to what God is saying. So that puts faith in a kind of context. Let's go back to the 3. Authority, atmosphere of faith, prayer as dependence. It's a lesson in the role of faith. And it all comes back to relationship. Jesus is at the center of the frame. We're listening to Him, following His instructions. He will speak quietly into our minds. And that will release the unlimited power of God. That's where the focus is. Not on our faith, not on our self-effort, not on screwing up our determination. The relationship implies we trust Jesus. We have confidence in Him. And then we do it. Leads to action. And it's not measured by quantity. The very young child can have total trust and confidence in their parent. But the key thing is the right direction. The trust and confidence are placed on Jesus. Not on ourselves, not on our reputation or abilities, not on the correctness of our theology. Implicit, quiet, simple trust and confidence in Jesus. And then Jesus rocks them back. You see, there was a picture of the Messiah image at that time in the wider Jewish society. Yes, they accepted the Messiah would be the sent one by God. He would restore the nation's glory. That meant throwing out the Romans, setting the people free, purifying the temple rituals, and restoring the nation's destiny. That's how they saw it. Jesus didn't fit that image. They saw the Messiah as being a national leader, and that meant power and authority in ordering people around. As a spiritual leader, bringing spiritual direction to the people, and that would be centered on the temple. Someone bring about miracles. Well, Jesus fitted that. But they saw the person as being an army commander. David was an army commander, and he was their great king. I was descended from the line of David. Jesus didn't fit the picture fully. And there are all sorts of domino effects on that picture there. What kind of Messiah was Jesus? And he has to train the disciples to understand this. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. We would have been too. Son of Man, that's how he describes himself, drawing from the Daniel picture, the one who would come and be given the kingdom. In the original is a sense of certainty. This is going to happen. And delivered implies delivered for judgment. When they heard that, the disciples, well, it's all going wrong. They can't kill you. You're the wonderful person. And they had no idea what was meant by being raised to life. That's not surprising. We wouldn't have either if we'd lived in the same circumstances. So Peter voiced the thing, well, this can't possibly happen. There's some big mistake. You've got it wrong, Jesus. No, he hadn't got it wrong. You see, he said this 3 times. This was the second time. The first time, he's outside the country, part of his withdrawal tactics. Now he's back in the Galilee. He says it again. And then on the way to Jerusalem, he gives more detail. Took them a long time to get it and realize what was happening, and they probably didn't realize what was going to happen till it actually happened. And then perhaps they would remember the 3 warnings. It's not what they expected. He didn't fit their Messiah image. But there are great principles in this. God's way is always suffering love. Oh, how often we get that wrong. We set up programs, we set up organizations, we set up structures. That's not the way. Jesus never came to instruct us to do that. He wants us to live for him. And one of the outcomes of that is suffering love. And when there's suffering and persecution, which is widespread throughout the world today and beginning to come in the West, what you observe, and history shows it, more and more people come to Jesus. You see, suffering love is God's way of breakthrough. Satan doesn't understand it, and we humans often don't understand it. The way for Jesus was the cross. The way up is down, as the great theologian Derek Prince once said. John in the book of Revelation speaks of this when he said they, that's the followers of Jesus, triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb, suffering love. By the word of their testimony they shared it. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death, or back to the gates of Hades, never overcoming it. They knew that declaring the truth of Jesus put their lives on the line. But that's the breakthrough. When others see this, more and more come to Jesus, as is happening in many countries in the world today. And then a complete change. After Jesus and the disciples arrived in Capernaum, or back to home base, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Yes, he does, he replied. Peter came into the house. It's obviously in his own house. Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? From others, Peter answered. Then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. But so that we may not cause offence, go to the lake, throw out your line, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Back to our map. They've come back into the country, and now they've got back to their home base, Peter's home in Capernaum. Now it was the householder's duty to pay the tax on the part of everyone who stayed there. And the tax was a few days' wage. But Jesus is making that point. He owns the entire world. Why should he pay? But he does pay. We have our responsibilities to be part of our societies. Jesus never argued and he never taught for opting out. That was a misdirection that occurred centuries later and continues to reoccur today. We don't opt out of society, we're fully part of society. And we contribute to that society. Yes, God will provide. Jesus and his friends had no source of income. He was a wandering teacher, relying on the goodwill and the provision of people that he met from place to place. At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them, and he said, Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung round their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. If your hand or your foot cause you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye cause you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. Here is another passage which has been misused and misapplied. Let's look at what Jesus actually is saying and interpret it in its context. It's about greatness. And it's in the other gospel accounts. And in one of them, the context is shown that they were arguing about who was going to be the greatest. If Jesus was going to be crucified and executed in Jerusalem, who would take over? Who would be the top dog amongst the group? Jesus knew this, and he challenged them with this question. So this is about greatness, not about children. You can find the accounts, and Mark again is just slightly fuller, in the 2 other Gospels, Mark and Luke. Now just imagine the disciples. They'd seen the miraculous power of Jesus. They'd experienced something of it. They heard about the kingdom of God and the teaching of Jesus. They were beginning to understand Jesus was the Messiah, is the Messiah, the sent one of God. They understood Jesus as the Son of the living God. Jesus was a human being in whom all the fullness of God rested completely. And they saw this as a ladder to their own advancement. They've been associated with this great man. Huh, greatness lies ahead for us. But if he's taken from us, who takes over? And Jesus says that. And that little pair of sentences has been abused again and again. The word change there means change direction, turning in the sense of changing direction. You don't think this way, who's going to be top dog, who's going to be in control. Change direction. Become the spiritual realm where God is king, is the kingdom of heaven. It's nothing to do with booking your meal ticket to heaven. When we're in the kingdom, that's a here and now experience. Yes, it leads on to something wonderful beyond the grave. But it's the spiritual realm where God is king. But the word there is speaking of children of roughly that age. There were several words for child in the original language. Nothing to do with infants. They don't use that. It's not, Matthew doesn't use that word. If in fact you look at the account in Mark, Jesus calls a young boy to come over, and he wants an illustration of what true greatness is not, because the disciples had got it wrong. Perhaps the little boy called over was Peter's son. We don't know. Children are humble. You see, in the society of that day, the child had low status. We value children much more today. But at that time, the children basically were brought into life, and they were the future and of the survival of their parents in a subsistence economy. And the child, they weren't educated. Very quickly, at a very young age, they'd be working in the fields with the parents. They had no status. They had a lowly position. They couldn't order around adults. They couldn't manipulate adults. The culture did not allow it. That's the opposite of how the disciples were seeing greatness. That's the truth. In the kingdom, we're not competing to be top dog. In the case here of the disciples, who's going to take over? Who are going to be the key leaders when Jesus is executed? In the kingdom, we compete to serve others. Humble. The child served the adults. That was the culture of the day. That's why Jesus used the child as the illustration. You don't have any status, and if you've got no status, you can't compete for status. The child had no status in that culture. And if you've got no status, you've got no competition for status. Oh, how we've got this so wrong in our Christian communities. We've got ranks and hierarchies and status and position and authority. The key is to compete to serve others. Radical. The kingdom of God. You see, as soon as you mention the word kingdom, immediately there's a kind of idea of a king, an authority structure, a hierarchy, status consciousness, a formally constituted authority. That's the way the disciples were thinking. It's the way we think. It's the way all human beings think. No, that's not the way. In the kingdom, there's mutual responsibility. It comes back to relationship. We're competing to serve others. You see, the human value scale and the kingdom value scale are totally different. Human value scale thinks that way. And that has infiltrated our churches. Kingdom value scale is very different. See, this is the point Jesus was making to this group of disciples. He was training them for moving things forward when he left this planet physically. There's a total inversion of values. You can see it in the teaching way back in chapters 5, 6 and 7 of Matthew. Comes back again here. Basis of entry. No preconditions. Only a willingness to want to change. You want to come in. You want something better. You don't sometimes know what it is that's better. But you recognize, I've messed up. I want something better. In the kingdom, there's no status. There are no ranks. There are no positions. All of us are valued equally. Doesn't depend on your abilities. Doesn't depend on your intellect. Doesn't depend on your experience. Equally valued. And everything is built around our agenda as the best for the other. We compete to serve others. Jesus is having to make the disciples rethink things afresh. He upturns it completely. Then he goes on. Now remember, we're talking about a young child, roughly primary school age. But he's using the child as an illustration of the young believer, a young follower of Jesus, because he speaks about those who believe in me. The word can't be an infant, and an infant can't believe in Jesus. Two alternatives. Welcoming the young child, causing him to stumble. Welcoming the young believer, causing them to stumble. Two alternatives. But remember, believe is the same word as faith. We're taking Jesus seriously and responding accordingly. And that involves accepting that he can heal, restore and forgive. That's the upper heavy millstone, the word that's used there. You could barely carry it. And if it was round your neck, you wouldn't survive if you were tossed into the sea. Pretty draconian, not literal. It's a stark warning. Jesus jolting these disciples. They were looking about organization. Who's going to be top dog? Who's going to have power? Who's going to control? Who's going to have a status? And he jolts them with this blunt message. You see, it's nothing really to do with young children. Jesus merely calls over the young boy, and it's used as a model. Greatness is nothing to do with hierarchy, power, pushing people around. We're talking about the child who lived to serve their parents. And then it goes on to that. And again, it's too easy to misinterpret this. Causing people to stumble. You see, we have responsibilities towards others in the kingdom. Oh, let us be very, very careful that things we say, things we do, maybe inadvertently, they will cause somebody to be put off. They will hinder someone's growth and development in the kingdom. This is life in the kingdom of heaven. We're talking about growth, development in the kingdom of heaven, here and now. The phrase there means fire of the ages. It's nothing to do with lasting forever. It's a fire characteristic of a different age. And fire of hell, a different word for hell here, and the word refers to the rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where the rubbish of the city was burned continuously. It's not about eternal destiny in our usual way of thinking of it. Essentially, it's about destruction. We lose out. We lose out completely for ourselves, but we damage others. Damaging others in the kingdom causes us to lose out very seriously, and Jesus using very blunt and strong language. You see, if the disciples had gone forward, produced a chain of command, an organizational structure, a hierarchy, a top dog, that would have destroyed the very nature of the kingdom and destroyed themselves in it. It would never have grown. Jesus has to change their way of thinking completely, and he uses this vivid illustration to make his point. In modern terms, remove anything which causes others to stumble. And that means we have to look at all aspects of the expression of kingdom life. And there are things going on in churches which can misinterpret and mislead and cause others to stumble. We've got to look at things fresh. And you can't tell from the English, but it's in the singular. It's individual responsibility. Each of us individually is responsible. And that's what Jesus is stressing. The infinite preciousness of each individual before God. Don't do anything, say anything, inadvertently or deliberately, that might hinder the growth in the kingdom of any precious, infinitely precious follower of Jesus. It's a new way of leadership, and it's a new concept of moving forward. Training the disciples. Let's bring it together. Miracles require an atmosphere of faith, and that is based on the relationship with Jesus, releasing the unlimited power of God. God's way is always suffering love, and it's something we've got to work through in our lives. Jesus went to a cross. In the kingdom, the values of the world systems are turned upside down. And we mustn't let the values of our culture and society infiltrate into the relationships we have in the kingdom today. Remove anything which causes others to stumble. That means we've got to jolt and look at things. Jesus' message is strong and clear. We are individually responsible for our behavior and how we treat others, because everyone is infinitely precious to God. Jesus is speaking about relationships within the kingdom. That is the first section, looking at the training of the disciples of Jesus. Jesus is preparing his disciples that he has to go to Jerusalem, and he starts on that journey. And we'll look at more training he gives to them so that they can cope and move forward after his crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension.